What's up, everybody? I know we're just waiting for things to start up, so I'm going to give it a second. What's up, everybody? How's it going? Let's talk about COP. Baby. If you are taking a look, I've actually made this a little bit of a fundraiser live. I try to do this whenever I can just to give some love to the grassroots, some investment to activists and organizers across the United States and the world. A lot of times when I do this, these organizations have no idea that I'm about to do it because I scroll through and I say, can we, let's see who we can help out today. And I just kind of go ahead and do it. And so sometimes even my own team doesn't know. We always make sure that the orgs are legit. They're always people that we're in community with and such. But the actual timing of when we do it sometimes is a surprise. And so today, just so you know, Soulfire Farm is who I picked. They do an enormous amount of food injustice, and they work in food justice work with Black, Indigenous, and other frontline communities, rural and urban. Extra perk of them being based right here in New York. But you can go check them out. They also do a lot of Skillshare online, so you can learn a lot from them. A lot of just frankly skills on making your food practices more sustainable. If you want to do an urban garden, if you want to do something in your backyard, or if you just want to plug into food justice work with Black, Indigenous, and frontline communities, check them out, show them some love if you'd like, but I just decided to append them here. But overall, let's talk about COP, okay? As you all, if you've been following my Instagram stories for the last couple of days, I have been kind of sharing with you all some of the behind the scenes from COP and showing you all what it looks like to actually be one of the diplomatic teams, part of one of the diplomatic teams that are sent to the conference. And so for the last couple of days, I've been showing you all the nuts and bolts in terms of what I've been seeing. What does a day look like? Who do you meet with, etc. I have been reserving my commentary on the actual judgment, content, output, etc. from this COP until now, until we've been able to really be able to talk to you live and answer some of your questions, because there's a lot that goes into it. I don't think I can always fit them into 15-second videos, but I do think it's really important for the sake of transparency for you all to know what's essentially happening in your name, right? Because whether you're in the United States or not, especially if you come from a Western country or a wealthier country, you likely have full diplomatic teams that are negotiating for you. And what are they negotiating for? What are they saying? What is actually happening in these meetings? I think is something that you all deserve to know. So let's start from the top. What is COP at all? What even is that? So COP is short for the Conference of Parties. But what it really is the UN Climate Summit. It's the International Climate Summit. And so what the UN Climate Summit is and what COP is right now, each year is a different year. This is COP26. So this is the 26th Conference of Parties to address climate change and overall the climate crisis. So, one of the big questions that I get asked is COP a joke? Is it useless? Is it just, the blah, blah, blah that, for example, Greta Thunberg says that it is? And I think that this is a really important question. So the thing with COP is that there's over 30,000 people that attend. There are different major segments of COP. There are the actual what they call the political confab area of COP, which is those party-to-party negotiations. But then there's also overall grassroots conferencing and organizing that happens in COP, as well as discussion of emerging trends and technologies and other sorts of things. So I think with this question of blah, 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 the answer is like, yes, but there's a lot more to it than that. And I want to dig into it because I think it's really important that people understand that COP is important, even as we are disappointed by it. And this is why. Because my concern is that if people write off COP and if people think that it's just blah, 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 then we think that that's a reason to ignore it. And the thing is that these negotiations and the outcomes of these negotiations are too important for us to ignore, even when we think that the results are underwhelming. And that is why I think it's so important that, for example, what Fridays for Future is doing in organizing massive protests during the conference and around the conference is extremely significant. We need people in the streets and we need pressure in there. And what I found is that in those negotiations, what I saw were leaders, global leaders at the highest levels, being very concerned and nervous about public sentiment and opinion. And I think that that is a very, very, very positive development, because in prior COPs and in prior climate summits, I don't think that these leaders were as hot under the collar about what the public sentiment and what public opinion of the outcomes of their negotiations were going to be. And the reason they weren't really as concerned before is because people weren't watching as much before. And so I think it's really important that we continue to keep the pressure up, because I want you to know that it's working. And one of the things that I see in politics all the time, whether it's in climate, whether it's in evictions, whether it's in all these other types of areas, I even see it sometimes when people would protest outside of the steps of the Capitol, is that politicians pretend, that's the important word, they pretend to ignore protests. They pretend to not see protesters. They pretend to not hear them. They kind of like, you'll be a big picket line and people will just be walking across them, kind of ignoring them. But they can't ignore them. And it does get to them. And I saw people in these negotiations feel defensive about the allegation that they're just blah, blah, blah. And that these things don't matter and that they're not doing enough. And that defensiveness often results in them it pushes them to try even harder to prove that it's not just blah, blah, blah. And so I just want you all to know that even if in some of these final results, even if it's still not sufficient, even whatever they come up with is still going to be more than what they would have otherwise, because there is increasing concern about the criticisms of the results of these negotiations. And so I think that I just want you all to know that it is being heard and felt on the inside 100%. Even if the sentiment that's trying to get across is that this is just a little thing that's happening. It's not a little thing that's happening. It very much is adding pressure inside of those rooms, because the thing is that there is a point of public opinion where if it gets so bad, it delegitimizes the institutions of governance, the institutions of finance, education, etc., their legitimacy begins to be questioned. And if things are starting to be seen as illegitimate, then power starts to crack. It becomes a very big concern. So I just want you all to know that the protests are working. Now, some of the other things that I think are important to see in COP, though, is that there's good news and there's bad news, right? The good news, I'm like, should I start with the bad news or should I start with the good news? What do you all think? Should I start with the bad news or should I start with the good news? Maybe I will start. I'm looking at the comments to see if there's any opinions here. Now, anyways, so I'll start with bad news so that I can end with good news. Okay, I'm seeing here people are saying bad news. I'll start with the bad news so that we can go with the good news. The bad news is that I think if you are under the age of, 40, the ambitions and timelines that people are setting out are not good enough for us. I mean, COP, like the whole big thing with COP is we're going to go net zero on emissions by 2050. And like, that's like this big ambitious thing. And the thing is, it's like a lot of these people making these decisions are, and I'm sorry because people get very upset with me. People are always kind of throwing these accusations of ageism towards me and all of these things. But I mean, there is just a basic biology here that we have to contend with, which is that if you are under the age of 40, you are very likely going to you have a very high possibility of seeing the year 2050. And that creates a totally different set of incentives than if you are older, making decisions for a time when you will no longer be alive to see them. And older people have grandchildren and they care about their grandchildren. And for some, for huge populations of people who care about their grandkids, that puts a skin in their game for their fight. But that frankly does not apply to all older people. Some of those people are they think that if they are rich enough, that they will able to have their kids inherit enough wealth to shield them from the climate crisis. And that is simply not going to be the case. And I don't think that has really sunk in yet for a lot of people. And so for some folks, when we see this thing of net zero by 2050, they're like, yeah, like this is great. This is a huge transition, like all of those things. And that might be relative to the status quo now, but for us, that's really not good enough. So let's talk about why net zero by 2050 is not really acceptable for young people. And this was really one of the central calls from the streets and protesters outside of COP this year. It was net zero by 2050 is ridiculous. And the reason that they say that is because of the following. Net zero emissions does not mean zero emissions. So what we're talking about is by the year 2050, we will still be, that's Deco. We will still be emitting fossil fuel emissions, CO2, methane, etc. And that's still what that means, net zero. The net means they're saying, we're going to be invested in and engaged in so much drawdown technology and drawdown practices that the amount that we're going to be drawing down is going to be equal to the amount that we're emitting. So it's going to be a wash. So that's great. By 2050. So that's not even a promise that we will have zero emissions even before I'm dead or any of us may die, and that is it's just not acceptable in a world of 1.5, 2 degrees, etc. Of Celsius worth of warming, because I don't think it's sunk in for a lot of people. A lot of people may not know this. We're living our day-to-day lives, but the stakes here are really huge. What we're seeing right now, for example, wildfires in California, what we saw in Australia, what we saw, even in our district here in New York 14, with Hurricane Ida and people drowning in their basement apartments, all of these things. Like, this is just the beginning, guys. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but this is the science of it. What we are seeing right now is just the beginning. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And there is a certain amount of worse that is already locked in. The governments knew that climate change was real over 30 years ago. And we had a very important opportunity in the early 90s with the Kyoto protocols and conference, etc., to address this problem before it started. A lot of people don't know about half of all emissions on Earth, climate change contributing emissions, about half of them have all been emitted since the first episode of Seinfeld premiered. So this is a very recent problem that has created global instabilities in, frankly, a course of 20 to 30 years. And so this is a huge problem that we're having. A lot of it has to do with emissions. And we have to draw them down. Not only draw them down, but we have to bring emissions to zero by 2050. So what do we do about that, right? Because if we do nothing, if we continue at the pace that we're at, which I do not believe is going to happen, I just want to set the record. But I want you to know that if the pace of emissions continues the way that it has been, we would reach up to 4 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, and also by 2100. And these predictions are very hard to lock in because there's a lot of correlating and interlocking factors. But overall, what's been considered is that at 4 degrees Celsius, if we continue our trends and do not stop, for those folks that think that climate change is a hoax or that it's not real, we should do nothing about it, etc. By the year 2100, half of all land mass on Earth will be uninhabitable to human life. That means think of the Earth, think of the land, think of half of it and making it uninhabitable for human beings. Due to floods, due to heat, due to perpetual 24. We're talking about like worst case scenarios. It would be year-round Category 5 hurricanes. That there's no longer a hurricane season. It's just hurricanes at the risk of Cat 5s hitting all year round. Wildfires hitting all year round. Sea level rises, which probably stands to be one of the most catastrophic aspects of climate change for society. Like, these things are just going to be awful. So like, that's the bad news, right? The thing is people are like, well, why does COP underwhelm, or why does it disappoint in the first place? Like, it's important for us to understand why. A lot of people just say, oh, it's just the oil lobby, it's big ag, it's all of these things. They're paying off all of these systems, and it's corrupt, and all these people are corrupt, and that's why COP fails us. Now, it's not to say that it's not to say that those things aren't a factor. Especially, here's something that I learned. This blew my mind on this trip. I had no idea. So we have long known that big ag, factory farming, etc., our food systems are massive contributors of climate change. And we also know that they have enormous corrupting lobbies in the United States, Congress, and all over the place, right? Not just limited to the United States. We've known that. I've known that. But what I did not know, and this was something that a member had shared with me, is that there have been periods, including in the present, that the amount of money that big ag spends on lobbyists in Congress is more than even defense lobbying, defense contractors spend. I had no idea. I always thought that defense contracting and all of that was probably one of the number one lobbies in Washington, and it is, of course, extremely, extremely powerful. But I didn't know that big ag often has more lobbyist dollars in influencing U.S. policy than even the defense does. Which was, and says, who is big ag? Big ag is big agriculture. So factory farms, food systems, etc. When you go to the store and you buy chicken from, Purdue Farms or these huge factories, factory farming, when we talk about like Monsanto and monocrops and all of those things, like that's big factory farming, not small farms, not local farms, not any of those things, but the big, massive stuff. So like, these are the bad news, right? That these lobbies are very, very corrupting. But what I also kind of saw at COP is that that's not the sole reason, actually, why things can be disappointing, outcomes can be disappointing on climate change. And again, I'm starting with the bad news, but I am going to end with good news. So don't get too, don't be too sad, okay? Because I think that the moment we give up hope is the moment we're locked in with bad outcomes, okay? So I'm not here to also BS you and be like, oh, everything's gonna be fine. No, I'm not here to tell you that either. So anyways, why does it overwhelm? Yes, there's the lobbying piece that a lot of people talk about. And I don't want to underwhelm that. But I also wanna highlight the mechanisms through which that lobbying occurs, because it's not just like a bunch of lobbyists go to COP and they're in the room and they're like, this is something that I learned when I got to Congress too, is that in our collective imagination, we all know that money in politics is very corrupting. We all know that lobbying negatively influences our outcomes, but we don't really understand how lobbying actually works. We think that, for example, in Congress, we think that lobbyists will, like if there's a big vote coming up, we think that lobbyists will call a member of Congress and they'll say, you better vote for this, and if you don't, then like it's all over and all this other stuff. And like, yeah, some of that does happen, but it's actually not that heavy-handed. It's not that cartoonish. It works in very other kinds of ways, which I'm going to describe to you. So, one of the big issues at COP is that you have different countries coming in and wanting to make negotiations on how we draw down climate. Now, I'll give you a little piece of good news. The piece of good news here is that countries here, they all know that we need to do this. They all know that the threat before us is existential, and there very much is a great deal of motivation in collaborating internationally to draw down emissions. And for example, what we saw yesterday was that the United States, former Secretary of State and Special Envoy of the United States on Climate, John Kerry, announced yesterday that the United States and China have issued a surprise announcement that they will begin to open a collaborative, positive diplomatic relationship on specifically the issue of climate change in order to draw down emissions. Now, people may say, oh my God, what does that mean? Is it just on paper? That's one of the questions that I received, because it wasn't particularly detailed. It was quite broad, and this is where I kind of pivot back to the bad news section, is when individual countries come together on the issue of climate change, they're not just operating as individuals, right? This is not John Kerry making proclamations, nor is it ambassadors and individuals from different countries being able to come together and make these commitments on climate. They have to be in accordance with the domestic politics of each individual country. And so, for example, one of the hubbubs that we got and some of the heat the United States got was that several countries had come together to announce that and commit to the fact that and sign an agreement that they will no longer open new coal burning factories or really aspire to not produce coal-based energy by 2030. And people are saying the United States did not sign on to this agreement. And people say, oh my gosh, why not? The United States is not stepping up, etc. Well, the thing is we have to come back home, right? And domestic politics becomes very much an issue. As we know, there are huge communities and lobbies in the United States that would issue an enormous backlash to just a sudden proclamation of us, signing on to that. And so I think it's important that when we come together at COP, each and every individual country, as someone said, Australia came and really brought nothing to the table on this. And that complicates negotiations. However, I think some of the good news is that a lot of these countries, even if they aren't able to sign on to public proclamations because of domestic complications with domestic politics, they are in some ways quietly making investments in infrastructure in order to facilitate these transitions. So the good news is that there is more that is being done to draw down emissions and transfer over to clean energy than is always publicly announced. Because sometimes making public announcements about these things can have negative domestic or political consequences, but there are a lot of factors that are happening, including market factors. The fact of the matter is there are some areas in the country and in the United States where solar power... Okay, sorry y'all. Hello, I'm live again. My mic cut out randomly. I think someone, I don't know. I think I got a, hey everybody, thanks for joining on. I think I got one of those what is it? You need to extend your car's warranty calls. And when I tried to swipe it away, it somehow messed up my mic. Anyways, back to COP. Back to COP. I was talking about the bad news and I was talking about the good news with COP. So for example, one of the reasons why sometimes the United States can't always issue public proclamations has to do with a lot of domestic politics. But just because things aren't being announced doesn't mean that they're not happening. So that is one side of the, I said I was going to start with good news and then I was going to start with bad news and then go to good news. But that's a little kind of pepper of good news as I go into this. That is, I think, a legitimate piece of good news, is that you may not hear that some of these commitments are happening, but that does not mean that some of these transitions aren't happening. It just means that, frankly, because of politics, and people may say, oh, I hate politics. I hate how things come down to politics. But the thing is politics is us. Politics is people. Politics is communities. Yeah, it's also lobbying and all this corrupt stuff. But at the end of the day, it's also because of the political realities that are reflections of the desires of certain communities or the way that those communities are brought together. Someone said the fundraise link. I'm sorry, y'all. It's just not letting me attach it. It would have taken another 20 minutes for me to reset it up. But check out the fundraise link perhaps on the last one and we can do that. So that is, I think, a piece of good news. Now, the thing is going back to bad news. Or I won't say it's not all bad news, but there are some things that I saw in that room that I'm just if the world is relying on COP and governments to stop climate change, that is not going to happen. Governments are a very important, critical determining aspect to stopping climate change, but they are not the only aspect. And so the fact of the matter is, grassroots, collective, people's organizing is going to be extremely critical in solving the climate crisis. And I want to dig into what that means, because people think of grassroots organizing as just like going into the streets and protesting. And that is one aspect of grassroots organizing that is very important, but it is a much smaller aspect of grassroots organizing. And I want you all to know that the other kinds of organizing that we need to really engage in order to help make this happen. And so here's what that means. My family, I'll use the example of where I come from and where my family comes from with Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico in 2017, Hurricane Maria leveled the island. It was just massive devastation. The electrical grid, power sources, infrastructure, roads, bridges, like everything. It was just one of the biggest hurricanes in modern history fighting the island. And so, of course, it was massively devastating. Communities went over a year without electricity or power, etc. But there was also, we know the devastation of what Maria was, but there isn't enough attention that's being paid to the resurgence and the positivity of what happened after Maria. And I think the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is because some aspects of the rebuilding after Maria threaten traditional structures of power. And that's one of the reasons why you're not hearing about it. But it is profoundly good news. So, as I said, after Maria, everything was leveled. And that created an opportunity for the island and for, frankly, any community that gets completely decimated by natural disasters to rebuild and rethink all of their systems, because we have to remake it all from scratch. And we actually saw a version of this happen after World War II. For example, after all of the bombing and all of the decimation and all of everything that happened, particularly in Europe after World War II, nations and countries had to completely rebuild themselves from scratch, which meant that they had to completely rethink their social and infrastructure and other types of systems because they had to remake them. And instead of rebuilding what was already there, they decided to rebuild in a new way. And, some would call this building back better, which is the BBB bill, which is like a bare minimum step that we need in Congress. But what we saw, for example, in the UK was that this was kind of the seed of the establishment of the NHS, time-wise, the National Health Service. In the United Kingdom, there is a system of guaranteed health care. No matter who you are, no matter your class, no matter where you come from, you can walk into a doctor's office, get the help you need, and walk out and not be bankrupt. And the idea of bringing a pocketbook or having to save up to go to a doctor or get medicine or get treatment is like a completely foreign, ludicrous concept. If you talk to someone in the UK about getting a bill for an ambulance ride, I mean, their jaws drop. They think you're joking. Well, the establishment of the NHS happened after World War II because this, so many aspects of society had to rebuild themselves from scratch. And so new social contracts were constructed. Now in Puerto Rico, we had the complete leveling of our electricity grid, of everything. And there were communities that said, we're going to rebuild from scratch. And we want to question and challenge some of the basic, some of the basic aspects and assumptions that we had about our society. And with respect to climate change and with respect to electricity, what we saw was the emergence of something known as community solar and community solar power. And what communities started to do, frankly, because there was so much trauma around the lack of electricity, and there was so much trauma around the instability of electricity and other sorts of infrastructure, help systems, etc., that a lot of families and communities started to say, I want a solar panel, I want solar power on my roof, not because I want to make some political statement, not even because I'm concerned about climate change, not even because of these things, but because I have realized that being plugged into a massive centralized fossil fuel rooted electricity system is actually extremely unstable if you are in a vulnerable community, because the power went out and it did not turn back on for over a year. But if you have solar panels on your roof, that is almost like or solar panels on your property, you have the source of your electricity right there near your home where you need it. And where community solar started to come in is that, so one of the issues with solar and wind, the thing that makes it structurally different than oil and gas is the storage of electricity. So when you put gas in your tank, in your car tank, or if you have oil or something like that, that is actually stored energy. It is energy stored in the substance of oil, gas, coal, etc. And then when you burn that stored energy, it gets converted to electricity. Now, so the actual mass is the storage. With wind and with solar, for example, the actual substance or the actual force that you're using, sorry to my physics majors out there, if I'm not using the term right in that instance, but the actual thing, the sunlight, light doesn't come in a physical form that is in and of itself storage the way oil and gas is. And so when you take light and you convert it to electricity, you either need to be using it immediately, so you need to, be able to wire it right back into your grid and take it directly to what you need to use your electricity for, turning on your blender or your hairdryer or whatever, or you need to store it for later use or to just stabilize your electricity flow. So that means you need batteries. And so this is what you see, for example, with an electric car, or people with solar panels on the roof of their homes often have battery storage. They will have big batteries, or they have a collection of lot of smaller batteries in their homes to store that electricity generated by solar or wind, whatever it may be, for later use. And so what we saw in Puerto Rico is that communities started to stitch together, and homes started to all put solar panels on, and communities started to come together to invest and acquire the batteries needed to power that community, so that no matter what happens to a power plant or what happens to like a big electrical grid, they will be able to have the electricity that they need as a community. And so this is kind of an example of an emerging practice of economic models known as cooperative economies. There are many, many other examples outside of electricity and infrastructure of cooperative economies, otherwise known as, and one perfect example is known as co-ops, worker co-ops. And this is another way that power is being challenged in an economic sense throughout our economy, where it's challenging the basic structure of you need a big old billionaire Wall Street boss, and you need a stock market, and you need all of these things, and you need to have your lowest level workers paid less than a living wage. Because what worker co-ops are an economic model where workers own the company, not capitalists, otherwise potentially known as billionaires. So instead of having one billionaire sitting at the top, owning an entire company, extracting billions of dollars of profit, while people are being paid less than a living wage, you have companies and you have that are actually worker owned, and so the profits go to, or the margins of that company either go into direct reinvestment of that company in the form of research, development, training, acquisition of better equipment, etc., actual investment, or it comes into increased wages or healthcare or benefits. And sometimes people say, oh, that AOC, she's some big crazy communist leftist, whatever it may be. And it's completely unrepresentative of communities and blah, blah, blah. But the Bronx is actually home to the largest concentration of worker co-ops per capita in the United States. This is an economic model that is very often formed that starts to be most often formed by the most vulnerable in society. And so if you look at, for example, if you want to learn more about worker co-ops, check out the New Economy Project. They're on Instagram. They're all over the place. New York City actually has a co-op center. And actually, I think the New Economy Project is having a conference or a summit this weekend in New York, teaching people how to create worker co-ops. So anyways, worker co-ops are one way of doing that in terms of how you do that with labor. But what we saw with examples of community solar is how we do that with energy, and how communities can start to decentralize energy systems and their reliance on energy, so that if one big power plant goes out, thousands of people's lights don't go out, or thousands of people's power doesn't go out. And as what continues to happen on the island. So this is a way in which people are starting to do this in communities naturally. But while that is really important for us to do on a community level, we also need to have the larger structural investments to transition our society to more stable forms of clean, renewable energy. And for example, when we say, why can't these commitments happen like tomorrow? Why can't we just shut off every oil pipeline tomorrow? There also is a very legitimate question of infrastructure and infrastructure investment. And so, for example, one of the things that I believe we need to do with US power grids is that we really need to start considering investments of having battery storage in our national power grid, so that we can not only, allow for these community solar cooperatives to be an option, but for those who choose to be plugged into a larger national grid, one of the ways that we can really help harness solar and wind and other forms of energy, I say solar and wind, but I'm not limiting it to that, is by having standby energy and storage in the form of battery packs. Right now, our national grid does not have any form of widespread battery storage, which complicates our transitions. So when it comes to actual timelines, the reason these things can't necessarily happen like next week, you can't like put a switch, is because there are legitimate infrastructure investments that need to be made in order for us to do that. Now, that isn't to say that those transitions cannot happen on a very accelerated timeline. I believe that they can, and that's part of why I introduced the Green New Deal as opposed to, a 2050 net zero timeline. So we have, the bad news, or like, why does COP underperform? Sure, you have the influence of dark money, but you also have the issues of domestic policy. You have infrastructure and technology limitations that are real. And then here's the other thing that I thought was really interesting, is that you not only have domestic politics to contend with, but you have global politics to contend with. And global politics, these kinds of conversations happen across conversations of all policy, from defense spending to climate to other forms, other issues that require international collaboration and discussion. There is always, I'm sorry, I want to put this in a diplomatic term, but I can't. So I'm just going to use the only way I can put it out. There's always pissing contests, okay? And so, but they're very real geopolitical realities. You have international power dynamics that are extremely sensitive. And when we talk about energy, infrastructure, defense, these are, economic power, trade. These really shape global power dynamics in very significant ways. And that influences our policy. So here's an example. You have, for example, India. India is coming to COP and they're saying we're not making any public, we're not going to make any public commitments. The world right now under, I won't say, what I should say is the Modi administration, because countries change, for example. Like the United States, we were under Donald Trump, and instead of, just saying like the United States sucks at climate, it was really the Trump administration that sucked on climate. And so I'll say the Modi administration, India under the Modi administration, is basically telling the world, no one can tell us what to do. We're not going to listen to anybody. We're going to do things on our own timeline because this is ridiculous. And one of the things that they point to, one of the ways that they back this up, and one of the ways that they make this argument, is that they say, we are a developing country. We are rapidly developing we are rapidly developing our economy and our infrastructure and all of that. And as a country, an industrializing country, the United States, because, we didn't know about climate change, the United States got to burn all the coal, oil, gas, etc. that it wanted as it was industrializing in the late 1800s and throughout the 1900s. You got to burn all the oil and gas that you wanted in order to leapfrog your economy and become a wealthy nation. And so you all get to burn all the oil and gas that you want. And now you're turning around and you're telling developing countries that we can't do the same because of climate change. So, okay, you hear that, but also climate change. So what do we do? Well, first of all, we have to think about this assumption of you have to burn oil and gas in order to industrialize. We have new technologies that are emerging. The thing is that it's wealthy nations that are really leading the charge on the development of those technologies. So the question that we have with countries like China, Brazil, India, and I will say that I believe there is absolutely, unquestionably, from Donald Trump to Bolsonaro, a connection between authoritarianism and protection and acceleration of fossil fuel interests. Petrostates, you can call them whatever you want, but I believe that there is an unequivocal link between those things. I discussed that I actually discussed that at C40 in Copenhagen in 2019, right before COVID started. And it is unquestionably a very, very tight link. I mean, I think this has to do with structures of fascism, but I'll keep that aside. And so, but there's also this question here with the United States saying, listen, like the thing is that if developing countries are going to transition to clean energy, they need clean energy technology. And we can't expect every developing country to reinvent the wheel every time, and everyone to come up with their own solar, everyone to come up with their own wind, everyone to come up with their own, like, whatever it may be, batteries technology, if fusion at some point happens, like, we can't expect everyone to reinvent that wheel. So one area of serious consideration in international collaboration is the sharing of technology. And that, of course, is a very fraught and complex area of global diplomacy, because it's this idea of, if I give, another country access to very cutting edge technology on energy, what could they do with that? That could influence a global power dynamic. And so that is part of what makes a lot of these negotiations very fraught, very complex, etc. And so I think when people say, what do you make of this agreement between the United States and China to open or try to open dialogue on collaboration with respect to climate change, and people say, well, this has no specifics and all of these things, and should we trust it and whatever. I mean, I think the announcement itself that there is willingness to actually engage in dialogue on this issue, despite enormous complications and issues that the United States has with China, including, there's you all know, there's just no beginning, no end, etc. to all these issues. But at least to say, in this one area of policy, we can at least agree to constructive dialogue and figure out what we can accomplish, I think is actually a very positive development. But the fact of the matter is that these very fraught geopolitical power dynamics are just as much a part of this conversation and just as much a part of these negotiations as anything else. And so I'm not here to excuse it. I'm not here to say this is a good thing. I'm not here to say any of that. But I'm here to let you all know that what I am noticing in these rooms, because sometimes there are these very large questions. Why can't we get more out of this than we need to? It's very clear that we need to draw down emissions as quickly as possible. So why aren't we doing that? This is me trying to share with you some of my thoughts on why that happens, because it's not just, big fossil fuel lobbyists with a mustache coming in saying, I'm gonna give you $1 million if you don't do this. That's not how this works. And so I just want you all to know part of how this does work. So there's that. And then lastly, those are kind of the issues of energy, but then we have the issues of environmental justice. And one of the central issues of environmental justice is that wealthy nations like the United States and wealthy communities even within the United States contribute the most to climate change and have contributed the most to climate change, except it is poor, indigenous, and frontline communities that pay the costs of climate change. For example, one of the most imperiled nations in climate change are island nations. And island nations have contributed the least, virtually nothing, to climate change, yet their very existence is threatened as a result. And so developing nations, island nations, vulnerable nations, global south, etc., are basically telling wealthier nations and asking wealthier nations to say, hey, you owe us in the form of loss and damages, loss and damage allocations, which other people may know as climate reparations. And if you're in the United States, this concept is not new, because there's very much the case of which I'm supportive of reparations for our Black communities in the United States. And so I think this is something like the whole concept of reparations is not just a domestic one, but it is a global one on questions of imperialism and colonialism and neocolonialism. And this is kind of an outstanding question. There's a question, and really the United States does need to step up on this. And so I think that pressure is something that we are seeing, and it is pressure that I'm also applying internally and domestically for us to step up in that respect. So, those are kind of the overall thing. That's kind of the overall thing. And then, of course, there's the question of markets and ideas about economic systems aside. The fact of the matter is markets exist today, and the way that the structures of those markets that exist today are the way that they are. And so you also have market dynamics where big companies, for better or for worse, look at the precipitating costs of renewable energy that are now starting to outpace fossil fuels. And they're saying, whether we like it or not, this is really where all of these, this is where the savings are happening. And so there is also a huge shift towards renewable and clean energy. There's also a global call at COP to stop government subsidization of the fossil fuel industry, which is, of course, something that we're trying to do here in the US. Now, people say, why can't we stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry? First of all, I believe that we can. But one of the reasons why there's complications around that is because there's kind of this emerging thought that the fossil fuel industry might not even be able to survive without all of these government subsidies. And it probably can't survive, at least in the way that it's currently structured. And so if you cut off US fossil fuel subsidies, government subsidies of the fossil fuel industry, that creates a very, that really cuts at the very foundations of how some of the ways that the fossil fuel industry is structured in the United States. That's a real threat at power. And while a lot of us want to see that, fact of the matter is there are a lot of communities that push back against that. And this also cuts to the question of just transition, jobs, labor, etc. Because there are a lot of labor unions that are very pro climate change. And in fact, one of the most, I think, encouraging and optimistic developments that we saw, in the last couple of years is that our coal and mine workers have issued support for just transitions of fossil fuel workers. But there are so many more workers in the oil and gas industry as well, and in the fossil fuel industry than just unionized mine workers. And so what people see is a threat to their jobs. And in communities in Texas where there are thousands of oil and gas workers, or in other parts of the United States, a lot of those fears can be ginned up into resentment and resistance to addressing climate change. Now, I don't think it needs to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way, but the folks at the top, fossil fuel industries at the top, and corporations really put a lot of money in ginning up that fear. But there's also legitimate pressure for policies to be extremely spelled out in how we will reach those transitions for impacted workers. Because one of the things that I have said is that we do not want to go from oil barons to solar barons. And there very much is a reality where having a job installing solar panels in many parts of the country does not pay as much and does not have as many worker protections and is not as unionized as a workforce as the oil and gas industry. And that's a very real thing that we're going to have to address. We want, and my goal is for labor and for work that goes into clean and renewable energy to be as high paying, and if not better paying and better quality in terms of benefits than oil and gas jobs. And I think that's going to be a real way. That's a very important, I think, key in making sure that we are transitioning those communities. But, I think ending fossil fuel subsidies has the political support of the vast majority of people in the U.S. But, when we talk about an issue having 60 or 70% support in the country, you are also talking about 30% to 40% of communities that are not supportive. And when you have very tight margins in the U.S. Senate and in the House, having huge communities of 30 to 40% disapproval is very influential in policy, whether we like it or not. And we don't like it, but it is a dynamic that we're going to have to manage. So that is why I think that we are seeing, and now on to the good news, right? Like all of that is the challenges. But now we're on to the good news. Here's what I think the good news is. The good news is that the political pressure, people being in the streets, the protests, and the anger, and even some people trying to stoke cynicism, has put very real pressure on governments to deliver at COP. Now, when people say it's blah, 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 well, the thing is COP is blah, blah, blah for 2 weeks because it's negotiations. You have to blah, blah, blah to have the results of the negotiations, right? And so the actual results of these negotiations are coming out this weekend. Now, I am pretty sure that they're going to be, in many of these results are going to be underwhelming and disappointing for a lot of people. But what they also, I think there are also going to be, I think, emergences that are positive and important. For example, like the U.S.-China announcement. The good news is that we need governments to step up. And I do believe that there is a lot of commitment from very wealthy countries and some of the countries that are emitting most from the climate crisis to step up. I think that is in no small part due to the change in public opinion. And so when people say, for example, in the United States, oh, the Green New Deal, like, it's stupid, it's naive, it doesn't make any sense, like, it'll never happen, blah, blah, blah. You can talk whatever smack you want to talk about the Green New Deal. The fact is, you're talking about it. Got 'em. And that's essentially been grassroots and activist political strategy till kingdom come. People can hate all they want, whether it is on climate, whether it is on our criminal system, whether it is on whatever. If you are reacting to our idea, then we are setting an anchor value. And anything that you do is in response to those anchor values. And so what we did with the Green New Deal is that we said, screw your 2050. I want to know what you're going to do in the next 10 years. 10 years is enough to transfer on infrastructure. 10 years, that is something we can actually think about. So we don't want to hear about the plans of what you think you're going to do after we're all dead, right? We want to hear your plans for the next 10 years, what you are actually going to do, not the little things you're going to put in place for projection for a long period of time. What is your plan in the next 10 years? And so the Green New Deal did that. Green New Deal was part of the presidential debate in 2020, and every single presidential candidate was asked to respond to the Green New Deal, whether they had a Green New Deal plan or whether they agreed or disagreed with it, and if they didn't, what their plan was. And by the way, it wasn't just anything, it also restructured the climate debate, because pre-Green New Deal, everybody was just kind of talking about these like market-based solutions, cap and trade, carbon taxes, like whatever. And I'm not here to say that, like, I'm not here to toss that into the trash, but what I'm saying is that that's not enough. If you think like a little carbon tax is going to stop climate change, I'm sorry, bro, but like maybe if we did that decades ago or generations ago, but that's not where we're at today. And so, so what we did is that we said, we're going to take these little market-based solutions and put them to the side, because in order for us to actually have a real deal climate policy, we need to do that by creating millions of unionized jobs and millions of high-paying, high-quality jobs in the United States. We need to address environmental injustices of frontline communities that are experiencing the worst and the brunt of climate change, and that is going to create the political energy necessary in order, and the political support necessary when you have a jobs plan and when you have a justice plan. The communities that will benefit from getting jobs, increased justice, cleanups, etc., will support decarbonization. And so that was the basic frame, a jobs and justice policy to decarbonize the US economy. And whether people try to distance themselves or not, the fact of the matter is we influenced and changed the paradigm of policy. And I'm not here to my own horn. I'm not here to say I did that, because I didn't do the Green New Deal. You did the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was developed from grassroots organizers, communities, people's movements, scientists, energy experts, all of that stuff. What we just did was put it in the form of legislation. But that's not me, that's you. That's collective effort, that's people's movements, that's all of that. And so that was a big part of it. And the fact of the matter is that it worked. When you see, for example, Joe Biden, or even now, moderate Democrats talk about transitioning to renewable energy, a lot of them don't want to say Green New Deal, they don't want to talk about Green New Deal, but you know what they do talk about? They talk about jobs, and they talk about environmental injustices, clean air, clean water, the ability to breathe. They talk about Flint when they didn't talk about Flint as much before. They talk about Baltimore and the Bronx, and they talk about rural communities, and they talk about family farms when they didn't talk about that before. And so it is a way in which people's movements do translate into influence. So the good news is that it's working. The other thing that I thought was just very apparent, though, is that we can't rely on these rooms alone and these rooms themselves, because there was representation of grassroots communities, organizers, influence, all of that. And what I heard in these rooms was we need to center and we value Indigenous communities. We need to support women, vulnerable communities, the working class, etc., which is positive. But one of the dynamics that I thought was funny is that no one wanted to name the water that we are swimming in. And so if you're swimming in water, or if you are walking in water, you have to walk a lot more slowly, right? Than if you're walking on land and with air surrounding you. And there are certain large paradigms or systems that I think slow down our transition. And we're in these rooms and we don't want to name them, but grassroots communities and organizers do name them. So for example, there was one meeting that we had, several meetings that we had rather, with grassroots activists and organizations. But not only that, in the conversations that we saw, whether it was from Latin America to Africa to South Asia, Indigenous organizations, grassroots organizations, vulnerable organizations, they talk about the water we are swimming in all the time. They say we need to really, they name capitalism, they name imperialism, and they name colonialism and the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism. And they say these are the things that are hurting us. And if we create a system of profit that is dependent on extraction, we will continue to extract from the earth. And we have to question the structure of these systems and how, are we just extracting ourselves to death? And so on one hand, you have very powerful people saying, yes, we must listen to the grassroots. They do in some areas. But in other areas, you have activists and native organizations, and they say, colonialism. They say, you know, our current structures of capitalism. And to which the people in power are like, yeah, we must listen to indigenous people. And so the people who are most effective will name these systems, but we haven't yet broken the fourth wall about that in areas of the most powerful. But I think that there are ways that we can, and ways that, and like one of the ways that I try to do that when I'm the only one in the room that's like, yeah, this isn't working, or sometimes when it feels that way, is by naming the positive structures that we and practices that we want to use and transition our systems to. And so I think when we talk about cooperative economies instead of competitive economies, then that is a conversation that is much more palatable to people than high-minded debates about capitalism, imperialism, legacies of colonialism, etc. And I think that that is also a very important lesson for us here domestically in the United States, and especially if you're an activist and organizer, is that it's really important, and this is something that I try to do, to expand our vocabulary of the world that we are fighting for and the world that we want. Because, you know, and this is something that I've said before, and sometimes it pisses people off, but if we only speak in, it's not to say that we shouldn't speak in radical terms. And we all play different roles, which is why I really don't believe in the policing of language of activist groups and radical collectives, because it is not the job of activists to elect Democrats. I don't believe that. It's the job of activists to fight for a better world. I think sometimes my colleagues in the Democratic Party don't really understand that and have not really fully internalized that. But that's okay. But I think at the same time, we're never going to get that world that we're fighting for if the United States descends into fascism. And so it is important that, frankly, you know, that the Republican Party right now does not take the keys to every mechanism of government that we have, because then we're like really, really in a far worse situation. And so, so for us, our job is to make sure that we are able to stave off that threat of fascism and create a very broad, unified coalition. It is not the job of the activists to win over the like pretty conservative, affluent, suburban person. But I mean, that's really kind of where some Democrats have to win. Now, the question of how they win and the assumptions around that, I think, are worth challenging, because we have seen for decades and decades and decades this idea that if we become more conservative, then, and if we swear off association with vulnerable communities and communities of color, that like we will win. And I feel like that assumption gets tested over and over and over again. And when it fails, you know, it's this thing that when moderate politics fails, they blame progressives. When someone gets elected, they say it's in spite of progressives or it's in spite of a base. But we know that Democrats would not be like, you know, we would not have, Joe Biden would not have been elected if it wasn't for Black voters, voters of color, and the youth vote. That's just what it is. Like, if you think that we can elect and have Democratic majorities win without Black voters and high turnout from youth and communities of color, like, I don't know where you get that data. But listen, I gotta hand it to people, because that argument seems to be gaining steam in mainstream media. And I definitely believe in, like, see how consent gets manufactured. Let's just put it that way. But, you know, I just don't think it's true. I just don't think it's true. I don't think that it matches with the math. I don't think it matches with anything. Now, the strategy and how you keep those two tensions together is something that's open for something that we really need to think about. But anyways, all that is to say is that it has implications on our climate policy. But yeah, and I think the good news is that I think that these alternative models and cooperative models are starting to develop and gain steam, and they're actually being built outside of policy and electoral systems in a way that creates examples to point to policymakers to say, see, this works. It's already happening. But that doesn't mean that those things can happen alone and exist alone. There are just enormous levels of structure and power that can crush those developments. They can either crush those developments, they can tolerate those developments by not crushing them and giving those developments breathing room, and they can support those developments. And so, what we're seeing, for example, in Puerto Rico, is an attempt to crush those developments because the fossil fuel industry has captured, I think, the Wall Street governed junta, the Promesa board, into accelerating pro-fossil fuel and fracking and natural gas pipelines into an energy and fossil fuel energy writ large, like coal, into an island where solar is precipitously cheaper than any of those forms of energy. And so the way that they are trying to do that is by imposing taxes and fines and levies that are so severe on anyone who wants to install a solar panel, like tax a solar panel or tax energy generated from a solar panel, that they will try to tax it so that solar energy after taxes is more expensive than fossil fuel energy, even though in truth it is much cheaper. And we see that not just in Puerto Rico, but we also see it happening across the United States. If you have solar, like these like charges, these like utility standby charges and things like that. And so that is an example in which government can be used to crush positive developments that are created outside of policy systems. But there's also another world where it can at least tolerate them so that they have the opportunity to grow. And that also happens with policy. So, for example, the Puerto Rican government doesn't have to tax solar as criminally as it does. And, there's one thing to be said if there's like a larger system and there's like a very small or modest levy on the use of that system. It's like reasonable, the way that we have sales tax here in the United States. There's like, that's one thing, but it's another thing to actually try to just crush solar. And so if you create breathing room by either not imposing these levies, fines, etc., or having them be reasonable, then you allow some of these models to continue to grow. And I think that's the same thing in the United States. In the United States, for example, in 2019, I introduced legislation that names worker cooperatives explicitly as a form of economic model. And according to our research, my legislation was the first time that worker cooperatives were named in U.S. legislation in almost 40 years. No one, not once, really named worker cooperatives in any significant way in U.S. legislation introduced, passed, or not passed in any form in a generation. And so one of the things that I'm very passionate about is allowing and creating policy and creating breathing room for people's movements to do what they do. I think sometimes one of the critiques that I get is that people expect me to be, I don't know, like, not just like an activist in my role, because I do engage in activism, but I don't know, like, I guess, I'm not sure, to like simultaneously legislate in a way where nothing gets accomplished, but to make a point. And you have to balance a lot of these things, because sometimes you can do that, and I do that, but it doesn't mean that you always do that. And so one of the things, for example, that I'm really interested in looking in is how US tax code can either support or at the very least not crush models of worker cooperatives in the United States. How does our tax code intersect with an alternative form of ownership? Does it recognize it? If it doesn't, how does it fail it? What are opportunities being left on the table, etc.? And so that's something that that I've really been looking for. And in terms of legislative strategy, it's like, what legislative changes can we make to at least give people breathing room to do what they do? Because I am a very big believer in collective genius. And, I think there's a lot of also economic and sociological evidence, including in experiments, that show that it's true. Like, one of my favorite examples is that if you take a jar and fill it with jelly beans, right? Take a jar and you fill it with jelly beans. This is a real example. And you ask one person to guess how many jelly beans are in this jar. Person may give you a guess. It could be totally off. It could be like in the middle. Like, we don't know. But most individual guesses are going to be wrong. If I ask you how many jelly beans are in this jar, each individual person's guess is usually going to be off. But actually, the more people you get to guess, the average of that, of people's individual guesses, actually gets remarkably close to the true number of how many jelly beans are actually in that jar. I tend to think that there are a lot of examples in everything from just policy, injustices, and other questions where that dynamic very much applies. And so we need a lot of guesses in order to open the jar. And people will sometimes see one guess, and a guess might be off by 30 to 50%, and they'll say, see, your guess is wrong. You should never guess how many numbers are in a jelly bean jar ever again. You are illegitimate, blah, blah, blah. That's what people do to like activists and to other, and so just like any attempt that doesn't work out, without realizing that their guess, including the failure of that guess, is necessary and needed in order for us to get to the right answer. We have to have, like, failure is a requirement of success. Prior failures in so many times, so many different ways, prior failures are requirements for success. So instead of dumping on anybody who does anything that doesn't work, or dumping on any attempt at anything that is off, and just using that as an impetus to hate or to denigrate or whatever, maybe we should approach things that don't work or a little bit off with a different perspective and perhaps an increased appreciation in an attempt to try. I see this all the time. Sometimes I do things and they don't work out. And yeah, it opens complete floodgates of hatred and denigration and condescension and whatever. But sometimes I do things that do work and open floodgates. And I could not do things that work if I didn't do things that didn't work. And I think that applies to all of us. It's not just me, it's everybody. So all that is to say, when we look at, I think ultimately when people ask me, was COP a failure or COP not a failure? I think there's a spectrum, and it depends on what you count as a success or as a failure. I don't think that this is like, I don't think it's really either. I think it's an information point. But some of the lessons that I've drawn on is that political pressure on these institutions is working. And I fear that if we say every time we do this, it doesn't matter, that people will leave the streets. And the streets have very much influenced what is happening in these rooms. And so it's very important that people continue to speak up and organize. And also, like, as I mentioned, the results of these negotiations are going to be released this weekend. And for people who are very invested in this space, it's important to look at the actual results of these and to pick them apart on a policy and point-by-point basis. Because when you do pick them apart, instead of just like, but if you actually say, this is wrong because of this is wrong because of that, etc., if you're a person that's invested in this space, that creates enough friction to cause adjustments. So it's important for us to recognize that we are a part of this process, even if not everybody is in that room. And the goal is also to support an effort to put people into that room that will also amplify and legitimize those critiques, including, for example, there was a point about military emissions not being counted as much in COP. Now, when that point was brought up, there was some resistance at the top. But one thing that I will say is that after we walked off that stage and walked into a room, there were a lot of discussions. It was brought up. First of all, there were some members that didn't know about the potential exclusion of certain military emissions from COP. And they didn't know them. They're like, is that true? And I read and knew about some of these exemptions. So I escalated the point. And that created very real heat in the room to address it. And I won the argument with other members that were in that room, that were saying, we need to look at this. And so I want to show how that was an example of, you have grassroots movements around demilitarization and climate creating enough awareness and agitation on an issue that a journalist was able to ask about it at a global climate summit in front of the most powerful people in the world. And while in the short term, there was like an immediate, kind of response in that moment, the ramifications of that question and the conversation continued after people walked off that stage. And it created a pressure point of saying, and we essentially broke a fourth wall of pretending that this wasn't happening, to now, because people's movements not only allowed that question to be asked, but elected people like me and other people in that delegation, like, for example, Congressman Jared Huffman, because people's movements and grassroots organizations also engaged in electoral organizing to put people into that room so that the point could not be dismissed, because people in that room would not pretend that it wasn't true and continue to bring it up. Now it's a thing. And so I want to just come communicating that to you all to actually show how it's working and how sometimes it feels like it's not, but I want you to all know that it is. So, I know that doesn't cover everything. I will bring up one last point, and that is agriculture, because there's so much activism around and like energy around our food systems and agriculture. And my last, my first half of this Instagram was a fundraiser for Soul Fire Farm. I'm sorry I couldn't recreate on this one, but the mic went out, whatever it may be. And someone says, why won't you speak about line 3 with climate? I can bring that up too. I'm just sorry, y'all. It's just like, as we know, this issue is like so big. And I know I've been talking about it for a while, but anyways, I'll go back to agriculture. I want to give you an example of what COP negotiations are like, because there is this huge thing of, negotiations. What does that even mean? Like, what are we negotiating, right? Who is negotiating? So I'm going to give you an example of negotiations and talk about our food systems and agriculture, because it's an enormous issue that gets ignored or under discussed on climate, and it's really important that we bring it to the forefront. So here is an example of negotiations that are happening at COP. And one of the big centerpieces of negotiations was happening between the United States and the European Union around food systems and agriculture. The European Union has agreed to and signed on to, I hope I'm not getting the name wrong, but it's called Farm to Fork policy. That is an explicit suite of policies aimed and centered on food agriculture and agricultural systems, and how we get our agriculture, how the EU is trying to get its agricultural systems to be a positive force in combating climate change instead of a contributing force in climate change. And so what we see in farm to fork policies is an increased encouragement of family farms, or organic practices, decentralization of, and kind of reducing an overall reliance on factory farming. Like, there's a lot of policies there. So that's one side of the negotiations. Now, the United States and our Agricultural Secretary Vilsack is very opposed to EU farm to fork policy. The argument that they're saying is that the argument that's being made there against, or rather, just not in agreement with EU's farm to fork policy, is if you bring things down to family farms and organic practices and all of these things, you are going to destabilize the food system, because it, let's see what the argument here is that basically, I'll put it in what they're saying they're for, is that if you stabilize food systems with large scale production and all of these things, then you guarantee greater food stability in the system. And the argument is that the farm to fork practices hurt the stability of food systems and the ability to feed large volumes to all people. And so the thing that I think really falls, so that's a stage of negotiations, right? And so both of these two sides these are the two different ends, and the negotiations are like, how do we reconcile these things? Now, one criticism that I have of our side of US food policy is that, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying here, but you didn't bring up climate at all on this. Like, that is a criticism that the US is levying, but I don't think that is a reason why our agricultural policy should be, US agricultural policy should be exempt from climate considerations and being part of the drawdown effort. And so, if in fact there are very legitimate forms of like weaknesses in the EU policy. So for example, there's this whole thing about GMOs, and there are ways in which GMO seeds can be bad, the way Monsanto weaponizes them, but there are also other scientific applications, like as temperatures rise, certain crops are going to die and become less stable. There is discussion about developing more heat-resistant crops, and that requires us developing and considering how we develop heat-resistant crops. Okay, that is a concrete example that we can talk about to have some discussion on. But that is not a reason for us to continue our agricultural policies as they have been, with no consideration to climate. So I happen to overall lean towards EU farm to fork. I mean, none of these policies are perfect or anything like that. But in terms of considerations of climate, I think from what I have seen so far, it's pretty unquestionable that climate considerations are being integrated much more, and that the US could stand to do that. The US could also stand to support small farmers, actual small farmers, not, huge factory farms pretending that they are small farmers. But we could stand to support that an enormous amount. And so on the last point, someone asked me to bring up line 3. Line 3 was actively brought up by activists and grassroots organizers that were in the room with some of these meetings and discussions. So I want you all to know that line 3 was brought up directly to members of Congress from the very top to the very bottom. And I am very much in support of stopping line 3, and frankly a lot of not from line 3 to Keystone Pipeline to all of this, it has to do with a lot of this has to do with the decision that Congress made not too long ago, relatively, to allow the United States to be an exporter of natural gas. Because when you look at Keystone XL and when you look at a lot of these other pipelines, people say, oh, this is for energy, independence in the United States. We actually already produce enough to power our own country. Whether you agree with it or not, that's just what it is. A lot of these pipelines are being built so that the United States can export and sell natural gas abroad. And people make geopolitical arguments as to why that should be the case. That aside, I think, whether we actually 100% need, I believe line 3 should not exist. And I think I just want you all to know that we need to continue that activism and that folks are amplifying those voices on the inside. You don't rely entirely on electoral politics to solve all of our problems, but also you don't not at the same time, because the influences of governments, mass media, etc. are way too large to ignore, but they are insufficient to entirely depend on. So two things can be true at the same time, and we can win. And I think that's the last thing I want you all to know, is that the worst powers that be are relying and counting on you to give up. I'm not even joking. They're really relying and counting on you to give up. If you look at a lot of authoritarian governments, or if you look at a lot of governments that are kind of taken over, where corruption has just completely dismantled 100% of all faith in a future, you see how people try to survive and operate in that, and they just accept these injustices because they just think there's no other way that's possible. And I want you all to know that another way is possible, that things are working, that there is an absolute commitment. And there are, of course, many complications and many challenges that threaten our transition, but I just want you all to know that it is worth it to keep going, and we should keep going. So I'm sure that there are many things that I have not been able to cover in, one stream. I hope we can start talking about those issues as well, but just don't give up, because everybody wants you to give up, and we can win. We can win the world that we know is possible, because the world that is possible is already here. And it's just about taking the world that we're fighting for and scaling it up. So see you all. Bye-bye.